Good morning. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo. And the various graphics in this presentation were produced by Terry Spataro, who was in graphics many times before. And Terry's also recording this and coordinating the event. And today, the Future Evolution of Consciousness webinar series and book, we're on Module 5. And we're continuing with the theme of the evolution of consciousness, future consciousness, and purposeful evolution. This is part 2. Webinar 4 was part 1. I thought for a while about what would be an appropriate quote to begin this webinar with. And this quote, of course, many of you are familiar with, and I thought it kind of summed up a lot of the essence of today. Progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentiveness. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And that's from the American philosopher George Santayana. And today we're really going to delve into the past up through the present in a great amount of detail, thinking about the evolution of consciousness and human civilization and future consciousness. And so today's presentation has a significant amount of historical richness to it. Hopefully there's things that we can learn from the past, looking at it, to understand how to move forward into the future. And just to remind you that on the Center for Future Consciousness website are the chapters that have been published so far for the book that corresponds to this webinar series, as well as announced through Future Consciousness Insight and up on the YouTube channel for the Center for Future Consciousness are all previous webinars recorded in this series. And today's webinar will be recorded too as well and put up on the YouTube channel under Consciousness and Future Consciousness playlist. Now, since we started this last time, we're continuing today. The overall description for the two webinars taken together is building on the framework of cosmic evolution. 3 basic features of human reality: consciousness, future consciousness, and purposeful evolution are going to be examined in an historical evolutionary perspective. As a way to understand these 3 connected features of human existence, we'll look at their evolutionary development. And in my mind, examining their historical evolution will serve as a starting point for thinking about the future purposeful evolution of consciousness. And the basic topics that are being addressed in webinars 4 and 5, the first 2, the evolution of life and the prehistoric evolution of humanity, were covered in the previous webinar, webinar 4. And today we're going to talk about the emergence of civilization and successive civilizational revolutions and the role of purposeful evolution and future consciousness in the evolution of civilizations, and also how future consciousness connects up with purposeful evolution. We'll look at theories of the evolution of human consciousness from its primordial beginnings to current times. And then the bulk today of our webinar is going to be on the ongoing evolution of consciousness and the concomitant evolution of future consciousness in paradigms of the future, from ancient mythology and classical times through modernity, contemporary reality, and the emergence of science fiction and futures studies. So it's the bottom 4 that we're going to be focusing on today. Just to refresh your memory, the last slide I had up from last time was on the prehistoric origins and evolution of humanity and the Great Awakening. And I went through various evolutionary steps in the development of hominids and then eventually to Homo sapiens about 250,000 years ago, and the out of Africa migration of them leading to an advanced culture, concomitant with an advanced culture around 100,000 BCE. And right at the end last time, I mentioned if you're interested in a strange and alternative view of human evolution, I brought up Jack Williamson's Darker Than You Think, which is a very fascinating book on the evolution of werewolves and witches, but put in a very scientific context. And it's important to bring up there are multiple different theories of human evolution. And in fact, Dennis Morgan last time brought up a alternative view of evolution and the evolution of humanity and mentioned the book Forbidden Archaeology, which we talked about a bit in the webinar last time. Also, Paula put up on the chat a couple very good sites on the Smithsonian Institute website dealing with hominid and human evolution. And there were links up in the chat room for those sections of the Smithsonian depiction of human evolution with a lot of visuals in it too. Right at the end, I mentioned the Great Awakening and cave paintings and artifacts and mythograms and the accelerated evolution of human culture and the emergence of language and the dual development of language and thinking through language plus thinking through imagery. And I just should mention here two very good books dealing with the possible or apparent duality in human consciousness, the alphabet versus the goddess, the conflict between word and image in human consciousness by Leonard Schlein, and also an extremely popular, influential book more recently by Ian McGilchrist, The Master and His Emissary, and where the argument is presented that there is a basic difference in hemispheric functioning between the right and the left hemispheres, and human consciousness is a combination of the two, a difference between the analytic and focusing versus a holistic consciousness with respect to reality. And as you just mentioned, it's been a common argument made by lots of people throughout both historical and contemporary times that there are dual aspects to human consciousness, some kind of fundamental duality. So we'll consider that more as we go along, but that's sort of where we ended off at the end last time. Now, moving forward, where I'm going to go from here is to the agricultural urban revolution and the Anthropocene epoch. The agricultural revolution spread across humanity between 12,000 to 6,000 BCE, coincident with a warming climate. The environment has something to do with human evolution, clearly. And it also involved a process of urbanization, the first cities developing, and humanity moving from a gatherer mobile type of existence to a more sedentary type of existence. This new development in human reality, actually, we could find indications of it running back 20,000 years into the past. Agriculture and cities first emerging, at least in kind of unsystematic primitive form, at least 20,000 years ago, but by 12,000 years, especially around the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, urbanization and agriculture spread across the globe. Plants were first domesticated through agriculture, and then about 1,000 years after that, animals were too. A lot of theorists make a big deal out of this transformation, stating that with the development of urbanization and agriculture, we entered into a new era, which has been identified as the Anthropocene era. And from this point on, we see a pervasive transformation, often purposeful, but sometimes unintentional, on a mass scale of the Earth ecology, the Earth environment, that the presence of humans begins to have a tremendous impact on the world in which we exist. And we'll say a lot more of that, but this starts during that period. Now, it should be noted that even though we were transforming the environment around us through urbanization and through agriculture, there was also a concomitant purposeful evolution of human nature and human society going on. I mention only two very well-known works up here that are reflective of humans systematically and in an articulate fashion, beginning to present ideas about how to live the good life and what human nature is all about. And I put up here a very famous Egyptian book, 2350 BC, Tahaptit, a book on wisdom, and the Code of Hammurabi, a book on the organization of human society, 1750 BCE. But also at the same time, as people were beginning to write about how society should be organized, this is purposeful, and how human nature should be guided in terms of ethical principles, wisdom literature, there was this explosion of permanent records, recorded history going back about 3400 BCE, beginning in Sumer. And so we begin to have a cumulative culture, which is a jump in historical consciousness. And some significant works that are rather ancient that indicate our growing historical recorded culture are the Epic of Gilgamesh, 2100 BC, Hesiod's cosmogony and his golden age theory, Herodotus' histories. So we were beginning to record and organize our historical understanding of ourselves. But we also were participating in predictions and planning and omens and prophecies, a very early work in Babylonian astrology and the zodiac from 2000 BCE is the Enuma Anu Enlil, which is a book of astrological predictions about things that will be happening based on the astrological signs in the heavens. So back early on with the Anthropocene epic, we see the emergence and evolution of histories, of origin stories, of theories of reality. You could look at Hesiod's cosmogony as a good example of that, and visions of the future. So historical consciousness, in my mind, is facilitating a jump in future consciousness. As we begin to organize our understanding of the past, we begin to find ways in which to attempt to predict the future and guide it. Now, it should be noted that beginning in 3000 BC, we see an ongoing evolution across all dimensions of human reality. And we see throughout this catastrophes and destruction, as well as invention and discovery and cumulative evolution. A good book on that is Right's Non-Zero. We see the rise and fall of empires. We see war and conquest. But through all of that, we're seeing this ongoing evolutionary process of civilizations becoming more complex with more inventions, and it's happening from the social, psychological, religious end to the technological infrastructure, environmental end of things. A great book on early history is Peter Watson's Ideas. Another excellent book tracing out the early evolution of human civilization is David Christian's Big History Maps of Time. Now, there are transformations going on throughout all of this, but people have highlighted three significant civilizational jumps in our history, which have been generally identified as the agricultural, industrial, and information revolutions. And even though these three hypothesized civilizational revolutions across the globe highlight physical dimensions of reality, human reality, agriculture, industry, and information technologies, there is this interactive coevolution that's going on between the technological physical, the social cultural, and the psychological. And in fact, this theory of the evolution of civilizations really just highlights the physical techno, but consciousness was significant and equally important and was evolving as well as human society evolving throughout these transformations in the physical infrastructure of human civilization. But I also should mention, just as one alternative to this kind of a theory of the evolution of civilization, Ryan Eisler's The Chalice and the Blade, where her hypothesis is that human civilization early on was a female goddess-centered partnership society. And beginning around 1 to 2000 BCE, it transformed into a male-centered dominant society. Now, this is a social psychological perspective on the evolution of civilization, as opposed to the particular technologies that we were developing. And it is not altogether clear if we looked at the history of civilization through the last 5,000 years, whether what we see is progress from this alternative perspective, because a male-centered dominant society has certain fundamental flaws which are still with us that the female goddess-centered partnership society did not have. So even though there's transformation and there's growth, there's alternative ways of looking at it. And these three hypothesized steps, agriculture, industry, and information, it's not like when we moved to industry that agriculture disappeared. Rather, agriculture was transformed by industry. And when we moved to the information society level in the last 100, 200 years, industry and agriculture were transformed. So each level, each jump forward transforms the earlier level and modifies it in significant ways. Machines came in with agriculture and computers came in with industry and transforming the base upon which they had emerged. Now, here's a quote from a very famous futurist book, The Image of the Future, by Fred Pollock, written maybe 40 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. I'd have to go look at the date. The rise and fall of images of the future precedes or accompanies the rise and fall of cultures. As long as a society's image is positive and flourishing, the future, the flower of culture, is in full bloom. Once the image begins to decay and lose its vitality, however, the culture does not long survive. Now, there's a very strong point being made here, which is the strength and vitality and the focus of a culture is a consequence and determined by that culture's image of its future consciousness. But once that image of the future in that culture loses energy, credibility, vitality, the culture collapses. So I see Pollock as a significant spokesperson for the idea that it is a culture's future consciousness that energizes and directs and supports that culture or that civilization's existence. Now, early on, I had mentioned that consciousness is the medium of understanding and shaping reality. And future consciousness, as a component or dimension of consciousness, is how consciousness has guided culture, society, and technology. It is essential, as I lay out in my book, The Evolution of Future Consciousness. Future consciousness is essential to all of the major developments that have occurred in civilization. That is, all of our major developments involve a dimension of purposeful intent and direction from the human mind, human consciousness, to shape and guide the flow of time, the flow of civilization. That humans, through consciousness, and in particular future consciousness, have created and shaped human civilization. Now, up to this point, I don't think I've ever given a clear, succinct definition of future consciousness. But I should mention in the earlier webinar, I did identify a set of prehistoric antecedents. But future consciousness, as I define it, involves the capacity for anticipation, goal setting, where I identify something in the future that I want to achieve, planning, laying out steps to reach that goal, ideals and visions which inspire and direct us, and purposeful behavior. And as I just mentioned, future consciousness is responsible for all the main features of human civilization, beginning with cooperative hunting, tool development, bonding, agriculture, also the development of cities. But future consciousness is both a cognitive reality and an emotional reality, where the dimension, the emotional contrast of hope and fear enters into it. So we could be hopeful about the future, we could be fearful about the future. And emotions and our desires are the energetic underbelly of future consciousness. It's what propels future consciousness, how we feel and what we desire or what we dread. So future consciousness is both cognitive and affective. And future consciousness is necessary for purposeful evolution because purposeful evolution is where I intend to guide the flow of time in an intentional and purposeful fashion. And in doing that, what I'm doing is I'm, in essence, identifying preferred directions, future directions that I want the flow of time to go in. So we acquired the capacity for for purposeful evolution because we developed the capacity to think ahead, to anticipate, to set goals. And because of that, we're able to purposefully guide the evolutionary process. Now, as I mentioned, throughout our history, there have been various fundamental civilizational revolutions, and each one generates various inventions, but it also generates challenges and adventures, disasters, and success. And in fact, you could look at the capacity of future consciousness or of a future aware humanity as in an interaction with the world. So we set goals, we make plans, we try to guide things, and the world reacts. And sometimes our plans and goals fail, sometimes not at first, but after a while. So humans, through future consciousness and purposeful evolution, created both the physical and psychosocial aspects of civilization. Everybody possesses future consciousness, but there's degrees of competence. And as we go along, I'm going to develop this idea a lot more, that our capacity for purposeful evolution is a result of our competence in future consciousness. So how might the evolution of our future consciousness empower us in the evolution both of future civilization and the evolution or the ongoing evolution of consciousness as a totality. But main point, future consciousness is integral to the evolution of civilizations. Now, as we've watched the evolution of civilizations, and we could go into that in a lot more detail, which I will in a little bit, we see an ongoing evolution of different theories of the nature of the human mind, the human spirit of consciousness. We see this throughout history. We see numerous contemporary theories about the evolution and nature of consciousness. On the left side there, I have 6 interesting, and there's tons more, books that are more contemporary, written on how consciousness evolved through time and particularly highlighting ways in which it has evolved over the last, say, 5,000 years. Now, something I always noticed with these theories of how consciousness evolved in the past is they also contain predictions and prescriptions regarding how to further evolve consciousness. So this is a significant illustration of a point I've made a couple of times before. Then as our historical consciousness and our understanding of history grows and enriches our memories, that empowers our consciousness of the future. So by looking at the past, we gain a better sense of how we got to where we are and where we might go or where we should be going in the future. Now, a particular thing about human consciousness that we observe throughout this early history up through today is that humans have the capacity for self-reflection, for self-assessment, and for guiding and improving their own consciousness, including efforts that have been made throughout history for how to deal with mental problems. Various paradigms throughout history have developed from religion, spirituality, ethical, social, philosophical, literature, even up to science fiction, regarding how to go about understanding and assessing our consciousness, our minds, our personalities, and based on an understanding, how we can go about improving it. Now, there's been lots of different popular theories throughout history, which have been assimilated into the general population regarding the nature of the human spirit, the nature of the soul, the nature of the person, and what this all means regarding how to understand and guide our future evolution. So we do have this ongoing history of self-reflection, self-assessment, and efforts to guide and improve our consciousness, our minds, ourselves, our psychology, that come from numerous different disciplines. And all these ideas trickle down into the general population. Now, I can't go into in too much detail right now, but I think that upon some introspective attentiveness to your own individual flows of consciousness as an individual person, you'll notice that there's a good deal of purposeful evolution, self-reflection going on within your own individual flow of consciousness. That is, not only do we collectively set ideals for how to evolve mentally, ethically, in wisdom, etc., we do this on an individual basis. Now, you might ask, to what degree does this actually happen in all of us? Because what about the attitudes of simply going with the flow or lacking the interest and energy and time to really reflect upon our consciousness and how we could go about improving it and whether we even should bother with it, how much energy we have for it? Are we often concerned simply with survival? But human consciousness, at least during the 5,000-year recent past, has been persistently evaluative, self-evaluative, informed by values and customs. And if we encounter someone who has absolutely no interest and no inclination toward self-improvement, toward evolving their own consciousness, we see that individual as psychologically and socially problematic. You don't want to improve yourself? People that would say that, believe that, and we actually see that as dysfunctional. But I should mention, from looking at the psychology of human motivation, that people, as much as being motivated toward improvement and change, are equally motivated by stability and survival. That is, there is a fundamental human motivational quality to resist change, to not want to improve or transform things. And in fact, this is a fundamental psychological theme, and it's a fundamental social historical theme that throughout our history, we see this combination and even conflict between the human conscious motivation toward stability and simply surviving and resisting change versus wanting to improve to change. One manifestation of this is the liberal conservative political dichotomy, but this is built into our very psychology. So even though we show this capacity and inclination toward and trying to evolve, improve ourselves, improve our minds, improve our personality, transform ourselves in different ways, we also have this oppositional motive in us to resist change, to want to maintain stability, not to be concerned about changing or transforming things. And this shows up in our history. So the evolution of consciousness, in particular, the purposeful evolution of consciousness has involved, and purposeful evolution of society has involved this ongoing dialectic conflict of the dual motives of stability versus improvement, evolution, and change. Now, I attempted in a couple of different publications, and this is a new version right now, to kind of distill from different sources what people have proposed as the hypothetical stages of evolution of consciousness, starting in the actually prehistoric past up to the present. And as a general thing to note is that a lot of different researchers, thinkers, think that human consciousness has actually gone through a series of stages or evolutions up to the present and even hypothetically into the future regarding how consciousness evolved. There's no way to make this into a one coherent image because, in fact, different people have different theories, but I attempted to simply highlight out some of the main themes that people have suggested regarding the evolution of consciousness, from immersive survival consciousness to simply remembering episodes and mimicking them, to moving up to an animistic, magical, ritualistic consciousness. Jane's idea of moving from an enchanted consciousness to an egoistic consciousness, Eisler's idea of moving from partnership to dominance, and I put an asterisk there. We also have identified as a stage here related to this, a big boss tribal mentality, the mythological narrative level of consciousness, the mystical transcendent level of consciousness, which some people even propose as a hypothesized final stage, even though people will identify it as a much earlier stage. The emergence of absolutism and traditionalism in religious consciousness, the emergence of rational, abstract, theoretical consciousness, the individualistic mode, heightening of the individual mode of consciousness, postmodernism and self-actualization, holistic systems consciousness and integral consciousness, and post-formal and meta-systematic consciousness. I drew these from a variety of different sources, but this gives you a flavor for how different people have put together the different stages, presumably in some kind of sequential order in terms of their emergence. But keeping in mind, after we have this list up here, that earlier stages of the evolution of human consciousness do not necessarily disappear when a new stage comes along. So just like agriculture did not disappear with the introduction of industry, magical, animistic, ritualistic consciousness did not disappear in human populations with the emergence of rationalism and of individualism. Mythological consciousness sure as hell hasn't disappeared. So this would be something to keep in mind as we go through where we're going from here, regarding whether there were stages, what those stages were, how a new stage may have assimilated or impacted earlier stages, but consciousness definitely has been evolving. So at this point, I'm going to start into the bulk of the presentation today, which is a historical overview of the evolution of human consciousness, different mindsets, different philosophies, different cultures that in different civilizations, and how they've impacted the evolution of consciousness, and also different images and theories of the future, the evolution, the concomitant evolution of future consciousness. And the place I'm going to begin is with, in the earliest historical recorded era of human civilization, circa 3000 BCE. The mythic narrative mode of consciousness in humans was the primary mode of both historical and future consciousness. It was the dominant mindset across different civilizations across the globe, and it provided a theory of human reality. Religious mindsets have been informed, inspired, the emergence of them by mythic consciousness. And mythic consciousness involved narratives that gave humans purpose and meaning in their lives. It was a way in which to perceive reality, which involved reality was personified. It was populated with deities and spirits. That's how people understood things. And they had stories about that. It was coincident with a polytheistic, multiple gods, multiple deities around them that people believed, and some people, a lot of people still believe, controlled, guided, populated their conscious minds. And I have down here a number of significant resources, books on this, Julian Jaynes, Roy Baumeister's book on willpower, Wright's book on the evolution of God. And if you're interested in an extensive description of what the term myth means, look at my book, Science Fiction, The Evolutionary Mythology of the Future, in Volume 1 for an extensive description of myth and what myth is. The dominance of the mythic narrative was coincident with another key feature of early human consciousness, which is animism or animistic naturalism. Humans across the globe perceived and believed that nature was enchanted with spirits. So mountains and rivers and trees, everything in nature was inspirited. And it was a non-dualistic view of reality. It wasn't that they separated nature from spirits, but spirits were an integral part of nature itself. So early on, we have an animistic and a mythic narrative mode of consciousness where reality is personified, where there is a huge amount of different deities, spirits that control and orchestrate and give meaning to existence. That's early human consciousness. Now, jumping into a early form of one of the earliest civilizations, ancient Sumer and Babylonia, 2 to 1000 BCE, we find there a common belief in this duality of order and chaos and conflict. We find a goddess-centered belief system early on that transformed into a male-centered belief system around 1800 BCE, where we have now the male god Marduk bringing order to the world, bringing order in a world of chaos that often is attributed to the female goddess who is influencing reality, and the Babylonians believing that civilization is an expression of creating order in conflict with the chaos of nature. The war of civilization versus nature, a common theme in the history of human consciousness. And we also see, as I mentioned already, the emergence of the zodiac and astrology in ancient Sumer Babylonia, which was a means for predicting the future. If we turn to ancient Egypt, which emerged around the same time, we find a polytheistic mindset with a central mother goddess, Isis. We see a deep concern and a belief in a life after death. Pollock says that the Egyptians were very obsessed with their future, with their personal future. We see the emergence of the resurrection theme in the story of Isis and Osiris. And we also see the emergence of the first form of monotheism with the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten in 14th century BCE, a belief that instead of a world populated with multiple deities, the entire universe is coordinated and controlled by a single deity. We also see a little bit later the emergence of Indian dualism, Hinduism around 2000 BCE, and Samkhya around 1000 BCE, articulating a common belief in Indian philosophy that there exists a fundamental consciousness which underlies reality, and then there is the illusory world of time, individuals, and physical reality. This is during the time we see the emergence of the philosophical, spiritual documents of the Vedas. We have a religious and spiritual centered consciousness. And with the Vedas, we see an example of something that pops up in the evolution of consciousness and of human civilization of central or sacred texts. In this case here with India and Hinduism, the Vedas. But we also see an emergence and evolution of Indian polytheism, the Trimurti of Vishnu and Shiva and Brahman, and monotheism, the idea of a universal underlying ground of being, Brahman. The other one was in the Trimurti was Brahma. Now, another factor that comes into play here in structuring human consciousness is the emergence of the cyclic theories of time, which was the dominant view of time. And we find it in China, India, Egypt, Mesopotamia. The zodiac assumes it. We find it in Taoism with the yin yang. It is the view that time is cyclic and it repeats itself. This is how people thought about the future. The future will keep repeating itself and can be predicted because everything goes in a circle. This leads to the belief that somehow balance and harmony with the circle or cycle of time is ideal, an ideal one should shoot for in the articulation of one's consciousness. There's no sense of fundamental change in this. So we don't have the idea that this cycle somehow is going to be upturned or something's going to come after the cycle, except another cycle. And um, but around the same time, we also see the beginnings of the alternative view of time, which is the linear progressive view of time, which comes in with at least as far back as Zoroaster. Now, note up here that the dates I give for Zoroaster are 1500 to 600 BCE. And Zoroaster lived in the Middle East, and it's not that clear from historical evidence exactly when he lived. Some people have suggested 600 BCE, others have suggested as far back as 1500 BC. Now, instead of a vision of reality and human nature as cyclic and the ideal being a balanced harmony, we have an alternative narrative here, which is mythic in ways, of a fundamental conflict between good and evil and the eventual triumph of the good, and Zoroaster envisioning the final battle, Armageddon, which has had a strong influence on both later religious and futurist thinking. And so instead of balance, we have this vision of reality as being war and conflict and victory. We also get the introduction here of the idea of a heaven, of some kind of paradise after one's existence on this plane of reality. And we get the introduction of the idea of a Messiah who is going to come and orchestrate this triumph, victory of good over evil. This idea is a teleological vision of the future and reality. It's the belief that reality is being guided by some powerful force, powerful entity towards some predetermined end. And what humans should do, human consciousness should do, is to align with and prepare for this cosmic purpose and fate that is orchestrating and coordinating the ongoing history of humanity. Now, a lot of people have proposed that somewhere in the area between 700 to 400 BCE, there was a significant shift in human consciousness, and they identify a set of key figures during that time that are associated with different religious and philosophical traditions. Isaiah, Socrates, Zoroaster, Lao Tzu for Taoism, Confucius, and the Buddha. Now, one particular feature that comes into significance during the axial age is the emergence of an abstract, rational, and at times naturalistic mode of consciousness as an alternative to a mythic personified narrative mode of consciousness. Go back to your list, go back to the list of stages, and you will recall seeing this type of consciousness identified usually as coming after the mythic mode of consciousness. And ancient Greece is often identified as one of the key origins of this new way of thinking, this new mode of consciousness that emerges among early Greek philosophers and scientists. I should note, though, given the interactivity of cultures in our history across the globe, the ancient Greeks assimilated various ideas that they took from ancient Egypt and ancient India. And one can see clear indications of abstract rational thinking going on in both ancient Egypt and ancient India, running back thousands of years. The mythic and the abstract rational mindsets ended up in various ways competing with each other in coming times, but the values and the mindsets that emerged here in different parts of the world did not exist in isolation of each other. Now, some key figures in the Greek rational abstract mode of consciousness: Parmenides and Heraclitus, the contrast between looking at ultimate reality as stable, unified, dualistic, and eternal, versus Heraclitus, who saw war as the father of all things, and conflict as essential, and change as essential. You can't step into the same river twice. And his idea of the logos, the logic of change. There's a fundamental difference there in how one sees and thinks about reality and one's own personal reality. We see Socrates and Plato come on the scene, an ontological dualism there of eternity and the mind versus time and nature. Plato develops a tripartite theory of the soul and the balance and conflict between reason, appetite, and spirit, an early articulate psychology. He also invents a very influential utopia, the Republic, that's modeled on his theory of the soul. And he argues for the ideals of virtue and sound thinking as a way to create the good life and the best life. There's prescriptiveness in this too, besides the theory of reality. His student, Aristotle, to some degree, went in the opposite direction, a naturalistic, non-dualist theory of the psyche. Aristotle is known for the principle of balance and moderation. He's also known for articulating a virtue theory of ethics as a preferable mode of consciousness. That is, our consciousness, our behavior, our way of life should be structured and guided and evaluated in terms of the development and execution of a set of character virtues. But Aristotle also articulates the modern principles of logic as ideals of conscious thinking. So a lot's going on here with the Greeks. We find a limited democracy, since the Greeks did not let females and did not let various barbaric other races participate in the democratic governance that they had. But this brings in the notion of self-determination as a key theme in modern, that becomes more and more significant in modern human consciousness. The myth of Prometheus is an archetypal exemplar of this transformation that goes into human consciousness between feeling a child and governed by deities and gods versus taking fate and control away from them and being self-determining in terms of the direction of human, of oneself and of human civilization. Now, even though the Greeks were in some ways epitomes of rationalistic and early scientific thinking, there was the other side to them. And again, keep in mind this idea of the dual nature of human consciousness. The Dionysian side, the side in ancient Greek that worshiped and participated in mythic, sensory, emotional, physical, and psychological abandonment consciousness. This idea comes in with Nietzsche, who we're going to talk about later on, that Greek had these opposing mindsets: the Apollonian, which is order and reason, versus the Dionysian, which is emotion and revelry and chaos. Two different dimensions of human consciousness in ancient Greece. So cultures, keep in mind, is an important point, don't necessarily have a uniform set of values, a uniform mindset. They often have various different competing mindsets. But a little bit after ancient Greece, we find the beginnings of in modern times of the theory of evolution, human progress, and an anti-theistic mindset, which is something some of the Greeks had, and the Roman philosopher Lucretius. Now, that's just a little seed, but it's a seed that's going to grow over the next 2 millennia. Now, but to pick back up with other philosophies and other religions in different parts of the world, we have the clear, distinct emergence of both Hinduism and Buddhism by 500 BCE, the belief in cycles and reincarnations and how to eliminate suffering in life. And the Buddha had a whole set of different principles for how to live a good ethical life, how to direct one's life. We see the philosophy that uh, everything in consciousness is ephemeral and transformative, and we need to transcend both time and the ego. And we see the ongoing evolution begun with Hinduism of meditative practices for tuning into and understanding and evolving consciousness. We also see around the same time as the Buddha, the emergence of Confucianism, which is the antithesis of Taoism in ancient China. Schlein identifies Confucianism as a male-dominant consciousness, where Taoism was more of a female type of consciousness. But Confucius, in articulating his very influential philosophy, which influenced Chinese civilization down through the centuries, it was a reaction to the social chaos he saw in the world. He believed in order and balance achieved through reason, social hierarchies, and rational control. It was not a go with the flow philosophy. He articulated, like Aristotle had, a principle of the golden mean of moderation, but he also articulated an early version of the principle of reciprocity. And we'll come back to that as we move into the next webinar. Judaic consciousness, the Ten Commandments, prescriptive in thought and desire and behavior, an authoritarian rule-based ethics. Judaism saw prophecies, future consciousness, the belief in a Messiah, but also a sense of covenant with God, a covenant form with God. So Judaic philosophy has an element of a rational, top-down, authoritarian mode of consciousness in it, but it has a lot of drama in it too. Now then, after that, I'm just throwing in here the emergence of the Roman Empire, of order and organization throughout the Mediterranean world. The Romans incorporated Greek ideas, incorporated the Greek deities. They had a polytheism. They transformed from a democratic republic consciousness into an autocratic empire consciousness. They also had their Dionysian side, the rites of Bacchus, of bread and circuses. But the Romans did have a set of values and virtues that they identified as critical to a admirable, ideal human being. And those virtues were courage, duty, loyalty, discipline, industry, and strength. So the Romans organized the Mediterranean world, assimilated from the Greeks, and had a set of values and virtues that they thought were important in the articulation of an admirable human life. Now, in thinking about Rome, this brings up the issue of the rise and fall of successive empires that we see going back further than Rome and clearly after Rome, a succession of civilizations that grow, achieve relative stability, and then decline. Civilizations are dynamic realities that bring a certain relative order to humanity, but there's war and competition through the past and up into the present between civilizations. Civilizations provide narratives and they provide prescriptions and ethics. They contain images of the future, of their future, as Pollock points out, and they all generate clusters of new innovations, both psychosocial and physical. But although they integrate and bring order, they eventually disintegrate. So human consciousness, human history is this ongoing oscillation of periods of relative order brought about through civilizations and relative chaos as those civilizations, those empires fall apart. There's been a succession of them. Multiple Chinese dynasties, the Persian Empire, the Macedonian Empire, Mesoamerican, South American civilizations, the Eastern and Western Holy Roman Empires, the Mongol Empire, the Islamic Empire. the Mughal Indian Empire, the Western Europe, British, French empires, the Soviet Union, the short-lived Third Reich, and as some people would say, most recently, the American Empire. And this is a dynamic dimension to human consciousness that runs down through human history. Now, I should note, having gone through these different philosophies, these modes or paradigms of consciousness, that they are not static, and all of them have continued to evolve, even the ones I'm going to come to in a little bit, since the time of their beginnings. So Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are not static belief systems, and all of them tend to be associated with different parts of the world, but they also spread across the world. Now, different people have debated whether or not there might be some essential set of human values or ethics or virtues and human universals to all of this entire succession of different cultures and empires. And there's a whole line of thought that in spite of the cultural diversity, historical diversity, and relativism, it's been exaggerated, and there may be some relative invariant set to human nature of ethical beliefs, ways of understanding reality, and this is a whole big topic to get into. So there's change going on, but there's also debate over whether the change is complete or whether some things stay relatively the same. So just to finish this ancient part, we have Christianity, where love and forgiveness and emotional ethics comes in. The Messiah having come through Judaism and Zoroastrianism is a key pivotal element in their consciousness. There's a belief in an afterlife, life after death. There's the Armageddon battle again. During the medieval times, Christianity through St. Augustine, there was the prophecy of the second coming, of human transformation. There was the belief in you're going to go to heaven versus go to hell. There was a clear dualism, the city of man versus the city of God. Christianity emphasized free will and choice, individual self-determination, but was also associated in St. Augustine with a negative view of the body. There's a teleological progressive view of time here, a teleological progressive view of humans. With Islam, we find a drive toward unification among the warring tribes in the Middle East, with an all-subsuming monotheism. Islam rediscovered the ancient Greek philosophers, not the medieval Europeans. It attempted to create an integrative mode of consciousness combining religion, mystical, revelatory, and science in the abstract. It had both a enhanced historical consciousness, and it attempted to unite the Greeks in its own theory of reality with a philosophy and ethics. The first modern science fiction novel was written during the Islamic period. And there was a war that took place for hundreds and hundreds of years over the preferable future between Christianity and Islam. Even though Islam attempted to unite faith and reason, the Europeans attempted to do that with scholasticism. And during that time, we find Dante's Divine Comedy, which is a synthesis of the ontology and ethics and belief in the afterlife of the time. And then we see the emergence of modernism with an increased emphasis on individualism and innovation, and the beginnings of a more forward-looking naturalistic mindset in Europe after approximately 100 years of the medieval period, which is soon followed by the Renaissance, which is Dionysian, goes back to the ancient Greeks, and in that sense, it's regressive. It involves both science, technology, and art. We see the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, again, a war over the future of authority versus individualism. So just in summary, and this gets us up to modern times, we see different modes of consciousness, different theories of reality and ethics, how to guide consciousness, different approaches to the future, but an ongoing war and conflict over the future between different fundamental basic mindsets. Now, that's a good place to stop and take a little break. I can just simply um, um, yes, in fact, on that last point, as you just mentioned on eschatology, that visions of the end of the world have been around for centuries and centuries. It's a common human mindset to think about how it's all going to end and to keep prophesizing that it's going to end. And there's a great book by John Clute on visions of the end of the world. I think it's called The End of Times. And John Clute is the a great historian of science fiction who wrote a book on all the different visions we have about things collapsing, falling apart. And this is something we find across the globe. I can go into it more so, but we think about this thing, about the whole thing's going to fall apart, the world's going to end. And we have all different scenarios for it, which are all versions of future consciousness, informed in different ways by different beliefs and theories. Now we'll move into modernity. The modern evolution of consciousness and theories of consciousness and future consciousness. First important event to note, the European scientific revolution, beginning with significant figures like Copernicus and Galileo and Kepler and Descartes and Newton, but the scientific revolution eventually spread across the entire globe, and science became a dominant mindset within contemporary human consciousness. It was a synthesis of theory and experimentation. We've had lots of theories about everything, but it was united with the methodology of doing experiments. It was a new mode of consciousness. A particular element in the ontology, the change in human consciousness during this time, is that we went from looking at ourselves as the center of the universe to realizing that we no longer were the center of the universe, that the earth revolved around the sun. We shifted from a human-centric, heliocentric to human-centric to a heliocentric. That was a mistake in my outline there. It should have been geocentric. It should have been heliocentric. It involved a new ontology of reality. We threw out the gods, the personalities running the show, and instead said it was abstract laws of nature. This is rationalism. It's the Greeks. Nature could be predicted. The future could be predicted and controlled. Francis Bacon published The New Atlantis, which was an early utopian vision of an ideal society. And even though Bacon was one of the key spokespersons for the scientific revolution, his utopia, his vision of an ideal society, was the synthesis of religious Christian beliefs and science and technology. And there were other ideal societies envisioned. Of course, there was Moors and there was Campanella's, and I talk about those in my history of science fiction. In this time, there was an emergence of the philosophical schools of rationalism and empiricism as epistemologies and theories of the mind. That is, should the mind be ruled and guided by reason, or should it be ruled and guided by observation? Is the mind built up through experience, or is the mind somehow structured in terms of principles of thought? And we find a whole slew of 17th and 18th into the 19th century European philosophers debating this key issue on the relative roles of look at the world and observe it versus think it out, rationalism being the second one. In Descartes, Locke, Hume, we find psychologies here that go along with it in these early European thinkers, with Descartes' dualism, Spinoza's incredibly articulated ethics and his monism, Locke's anti-authoritarianism and empiricism, and Hume's descriptive phenomenalism and his naturalistic theory of ethics. that humans' beliefs in ethics, ethical values, are simply a function of their emotions. There's no authority or no rational grounds for one ethics versus another one. So in Europe, beginning but then spreading, we find this this proliferation of a new set of ideas about human consciousness, about human society, about how to gain knowledge, and we can identify the scientific revolution as a starting point. I have some other book images up there. I have Condorcet, one of the first great futurists, and Nesbitt's History of the Idea of Progress, and Holmes' very fascinating study of Romanticism, Adam Smith's The Wealth of the Nation, and then Darwin. We're going to talk about all these other people and these other ideas on the successive slides. Right on the heels of the scientific revolution comes the Western Enlightenment, where we have a secular definition of progress, replacing the teleological and theistic definitions in Zoroaster and Judaism and in St. Augustine. So there is progress, there is development, but it's not being guided from above. It's progress in the world we see around us. There's a shift that goes on from spiritual improvement and the otherworldly toward being inspired from science and new visions of how to develop society and how to develop our mental and physical spheres that are informed by a secular scientific vision as opposed to a religious mythic narrative vision of progress. Nesbitt, in his book on progress, reviews many different theories of progress. It is a mistake, an extreme one-sided stereotype to think that the early theorists on progress emphasized material progress as opposed to social, ethical, psychological progress. They did not. They included them both. Condorcet, the endless perfectibility of man. Adam Smith emphasized economic progress, but he also talked about human values and ethics. He brought in the idea of competition, but he also brought in the notion of consideration with respect to other people besides oneself. We have Spencer's survival of the fittest, which leads into social Darwinism. We have Comte with a different theory of progress. They believed, a lot of them, that progress was a law of nature. They called it the law of progress. It wasn't a human invention, but nature had been progressing throughout its history. Humanity had just become aware of this and were taking progress by the horns. There was a contrast in these theories of progress between a better world would be a world of increasing freedom versus a better world would be a world of increasing order. And so these two views are going to compete with each other in terms of the ideal society, whether it's a society emphasizing freedom or society emphasizing order. But we see the emergence of the modern ideal view of democracy. And I say ideal because it was not practiced. But right on the heels of the Enlightenment in Europe, we see the romantic critique of enlightenment, of industrial progress, of reason and science guiding the future. The Romanticists emphasized emotion, art, love of nature, against reason, technology, modernity, and science. It was an alternative view of a preferable future, an alternative future consciousness mindset. And this goes back, this duality of the Enlightenment versus Romanticism, it goes back to the Greeks. It goes back to the key duality within us between cognitive, rational thinking processes as guiding us versus emotion and feeling and love and art as guiding us. But look at Holmes' great book, The Age of Wonder, in which he attempts to demonstrate the synthesis that took place in the Romantic period between science and emotion. So this could be perceived as an either or, but in Holmes' case, he actually tries to demonstrate it was a both and. Coincident with the emergence of Romanticism, we find the emergence of Gothic consciousness and horror. It's a medieval regressiveness where settings take place in castles and takes place in medieval settings. It's a reaction against science where we have ghosts and spirits. We have Shelley's Frankenstein, which is very Gothic in its conceptualization of reality. We have Poe, who brought in horror, hypnotism, mesmerism, altered states of consciousness, even some science fiction, and a fascination with death. So even if on one hand, we believe in the great ideals of reason and of secular progress, we have this concomitant development in human consciousness with respect to the horrific and the terrifying and running into the past. So future consciousness during this early period of modern times involves both hope and fear. It involves both the Apollonian and the Dionysian. Very influential was Hegel's, coming a little bit later now into the 19th century, dialectic view of evolution toward the absolute. We have Marx taking Hegel's dialectic and supposedly turning it on its head and presenting a humanistic critique of human society that's controlled by capitalism. And Marx viewed that society controls consciousness, but Marx valued equality as key. And Wendell Bell, in discussion of Marx, sees Marx as having a set of very important values identified in his communist utopia. And it's a prediction of the future. But following on philosophical ideas like that in the 19th century, we have the emergence of Darwin's theory of evolution. I should note, and I can't go into it here, that the theory of evolution emerged through a series of stages and developments leading up to Darwin that took place over the 2 centuries preceding him. So evolution didn't just pop into existence as a view of nature and natural change with Darwin. It had been around and growing for quite a while. It transformed both our historical consciousness and our future consciousness. It influenced psychology. There is no purposeful design in evolution against teleological views of the future. The future is uncertain. It's not guaranteed. It isn't necessarily going to work out a certain way. Darwin was associated with competition as a key theme, and Spencer, in fact, invented the expression survival of the fittest based on reading Darwin. But Darwin emphasized cooperation, ethics, and love in his history, in his theory of evolution. And David Loy, and I had David Loy's book up there too, Darwin's Lost Theory, brings this other dimension of Darwin out. But we find, among other things, his nephew or cousin, Francis Galton, developing the science of eugenics, that we can selectively, purposively breed better humans. But keep in mind that at the beginning of the Enlightenment, one of the key ideas, definitely expressed in Condorcet, but other people too, is that humans could purposively evolve their minds, their consciousness. And it was part of the development of progress, aside from the technological and economic dimensions to progress too. Now then, next person that comes up, Nietzsche, toward the end of the 19th century, the modern or contemporary version of atheism. Not that it had been around before, with Nietzsche's expression, God is dead. God had lost his authority. Nietzsche's the beginnings of existentialism, of modern self-actualization, of modern individualism. Nietzsche's well known for his Übermensch idea, the idea of a Superman who would be an ideal human for the future. Nietzsche's thinking about the future here. He critiques the whole ethical system of good and evil and social norms, and he critiques the objectivism of science with his perspectival theory of human knowledge, that all knowledge is relative to points of view. Thus, he was the beginning of postmodernism, too. Nietzsche's a key figure in European philosophical evolution. He is Dionysian, he is psychological. And I also should mention that as we move toward the end of the 19th century, we find this incredible renewal of interest in spiritualism and mysticism in the West, contacting immaterial spirits and immersion in God or the cosmic consciousness, especially in the latter half of the 19th century in Europe and America. So even though we have secular progress and we have science and we have rationalism as critical to the evolution of consciousness, especially in Europe, we also have these counter reactions to it. And here's another one, spiritual and mysticism. Toward the end of the 19th century, we find utopias and dystopias about the future of humanity. Some of the most influential, famous ones are Bellamy's Looking Backward, a very positive vision, Bueller-Lytton's The Coming Race, which spawned all kinds of groups identifying with his philosophy of ideal humans to come. We find Butler's Erewhon, which is a critique of technology and industry, Rabita's The 20th Century, and Verne's Paris in the 20th Century. We also find as we're moving toward the end of the 19th century, this ongoing growth of business corporations at a global level where power is being welded through wealth and through increasingly global corporations influencing all of human life, and the emergence of wealth and profit as a central human value and focus for both our future consciousness and our purposeful evolution. That is, the ideal here is to keep accruing more wealth and making more money and producing more, and it being centralized and controlled by various wealthy groups and individuals. There's ongoing opposition to this philosophy of human life, of the meaning of life, of the central values of life. Jeannie and I just watched a very interesting documentary on the Gilded Age, 1865 to 1900 in the United States, where this opposition between the wealthy elites and the forces of labor and the poor are in opposition to each other. So this hasn't even gone away. It's been around for 150 years now. But also at the end of the 19th century, we find the beginnings of the modern, at least Western, scientific study of consciousness and psychology. So we've been talking about consciousness. People have been attempting to understand it, evolve it, improve it philosophically, spiritually. But toward the end of the 19th century, people attempted to make a science out of it. They developed the notion of introspection, modern introspection, the analysis of consciousness, act psychology, functional psychology, studying the functions of the mind, psychophysics, studying the relationship of consciousness in the physical world, physical stimuli. We saw the emergence of phenomenology, the science of subjective lived experience. We have a whole slew of psychologists and philosophers, Wundt, Brentano, Fechner, James, and Husserl, who engage consciousness and try to engage it in a scientifically disciplined fashion. And I should note that as another mistaken stereotype here, just like the Enlightenment was not simply concerned with material progress, science has not simply been concerned with the material world. People have made an effort to apply scientific principles to the study of consciousness, and they've been doing that at least for 150 years. So science is not the same as materialism, as a philosophy of life. They're two different things. So now we'll move into the early 20th century. An immense amount of technological invention and innovation permeating through all different aspects of human life, transforming human society, first in Europe and then spreading out. It generated an optimistic mindset about the future, an optimistic future consciousness. but it also generated an anxious sense of the future because all these changes, and they came all over the place. An excellent book chronicling the intellectual history of the 20th century is Peter Watson's The Modern Mind. I also have up here my friend Walter Moss' book on An Age of Progress, which is a discussion of how much progress have we really made in this last century or so. But the early 20th century generated both anxiety and optimism about the future. And the early 20th century, latter part of the 19th century, saw just as much technological, earth-changing, human transformational effects as we see today. There was an incredible amount of different fundamental inventions going on. Okay. We also saw the beginnings of mass media through print, through radio, through TV, from up through the electronic digital. We saw the beginnings of the information age and the beginnings of the 20th century, if not earlier. We saw the accelerated growth of mass education and information overload, which had a pervasive transformation in human consciousness. We went from a general population that was aware of what was happening locally, but not too much about what's happening globally, till we get all these forms of media and information spreading out globally through a series of steps, which is informing people about the global state of affairs as opposed to simply the local state of affairs. And we see a continual shift from the rural to the urban way of life. It began in the previous century, and you could say it goes all the way back to the beginnings of human civilization with moving into cities and beginning agriculture. But urban life provided more sensory stimulation, social stimulation, more vocational opportunities, more vocational specialization. There was a concentration of wealth and products and innovation in the cities, and people increasingly began moving to the cities and away from rural areas, and it's still going on today. And this, I think, is a critical change in human consciousness at a global level as we've increasingly become a more urban species and much less a rural species. Early in the 20th century, we saw continued critiques of Western principles and ideals, including critiques of science, industry, consumerism, colonialism, racism, Eurocentric mentality, patriarchies, the waves of feminism coming into the thing, into the stew of things. We saw artistic principles of the past being rejected. Now, we also saw hundreds of future war novels early in the 20th century. There was increasing anxiety over the future. I was never aware of this, but there was something like 500 wars about the future written in a 20-year period. So people were very anxious about wars. We also saw a second scientific revolution and a disorientation of consciousness with the emergence of the theory of relativity and quantum physics. We had the expanding universe theory. Not only was the Earth not stable, but the universe in its entirety wasn't stable. And we saw this accelerated growth of science and technology impacting all spheres of human life. So even if people in some ways are optimistic, they're also pessimistic. And we have further dystopias, very influential ones, such as We, City of Endless Night, and Brave New World, and contributed into the general pessimistic attitude, depressive attitude we had. We had the Great Depression, which affected the world globally in the 1930s, and we had 2 world wars. So even further now down the list here, we had fundamental conflicts that turned into violent conflicts between fundamental future consciousness mindsets, fascism versus democracy, capitalism and democracy versus communism. So we had in the 20th century swings between pessimism and optimism, between conservatism and liberal exuberance, we had this up and down feeling about whether, we were heading toward heaven, whether we were heading toward hell. The early 20th century was filled with that and filled with an incredible amount of invention and change going on. And this had a tremendous impact, an oscillatory impact on human consciousness. But in the early decades, we also had the emergence of logical positivism and logical empiricism, the ideals of objectivism and a rejection of metaphysics, of the philosophy that if you can't observe it, you can't scientifically measure it, then it isn't real. And there is a value in objectivism, and we should, reject subjective views about things. There was the emergence of objective scientific psychology, behaviorism, which ignored or denied consciousness in the mind and thought that human behavior was simply a product of the environment and the stimuli and the reinforcements around them. Both Watson and Skinner, as the architects of this, believed that by modifying and controlling the environment, you could modify and control human nature, because human nature, going back to the empiricist thesis, was entirely a product of the environment. So we have this scientific approach to attempting to purposively direct the future of humans, which became very influential and popular, and it still is so in a lot of different ways. But we also saw the emergence and growth of existentialism, that humans are free and there are no external anchors or authority or certainty or purpose to it all, and we have to create our own meaning, and the self actually creates itself, and it's a very dramatic philosophy as opposed to logical positivism, which was a very objective and analytic and non-subjective philosophy. But we also saw around the same time the emergence of Freud and psychoanalysis, with the thesis, which throws a monkey wrench into a lot of people's views, that consciousness doesn't even control itself. The unconscious controls us. Desire controls reason, and deep-seated repressed memories and desires control what comes to the surface. This was a total undercut of rationalism and the belief in self-control. It was a new way to treat psychological disorders, and Freud actually adopted the contrasting themes of evolution and entropy in his theory of Eros and Thanatos as two fundamental forces at work in the human psyche, the death instinct Thanatos and the life instinct Eros. We also saw the emergence of holistic scientific psychology with Gestalt psychology. So there was a lot of philosophy and psychological philosophies and psychology going on in the first few decades of the 20th century, which would influence mass consciousness in lots of different ways throughout the century and the future development of psychology and philosophy too. Now, at this point, I bring in two fundamental approaches to the future, two fundamental modes of future consciousness that came into their own, especially in the 20th century: science fiction and future studies. Now, I have a whole series of presentations on science fiction, and science fiction as a mode of future consciousness involved a narrative synthesis of science and reason, the Apollonian, and the Dionysian, the dramatic, emotional, artistic, personified elements. That is, science fiction united in story form cognition, reason, and emotion, which is part of its power. It produced utopian and dystopian predictions and thought experiments. It increasingly informed and inspired us thinking about the future. Gernsback, who coined the term science fiction in the 1920s, said the functions of science fiction were to educate, which is the Apollonian side of consciousness, and to entertain, the Dionysian romantic side. And you could look at my book on science fiction, the evolutionary mythology of the future, to see why I think science fiction, in fact, is our new mythology, the narrative form of consciousness, the mythic form of consciousness, come back now into the evolution of consciousness, but involving a synthesis of the rational, empirical, scientific, secular often, with the emotional and the dramatic and the sensory artistic modes. Key figure in all of this, of course, was H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells actually was a source of both science fiction and the future studies. He had an exceedingly well-articulated evolutionary historic mindset. He knew his history and he knew evolution. When he created his visions of the future, it was grounded in a very well-developed historical consciousness. First, he created scientific romances like War of the Worlds and The Time Machine and The Invisible Man, which were integrative, holistic visions of the future. They weren't just simply science. There was a lot of society, culture, psychology in them. But he also proposed early on in the 20th century a discipline, a scientific discipline to study the future, whereby we assess present trends and we make predictions of the future based on present trends. Wells presented both warnings and prescriptive ideas about the future direction of humanity, both utopias and dystopias. And his contemporary, Olaf Stapleton, wrote exceedingly vast cosmic visions of the future as another science fiction writer who combined future studies elements with science fiction and in a cosmic consciousness vision of the reality in the future. A key thing about science fiction in our modern times, contemporary times, is that it is an immense, increasing global phenomena. It is more influential as a form of future consciousness than almost any other form of future consciousness today. When people are asked about the future, they often talk about science fiction visions that they've seen in movies. There's a social community dimension to it. It's multimedia. So not only is it something that you get through literature, you get it through the movies, you get it through gaming, you get it through art. So it taps into all different dimensions of human consciousness. Various science fiction writers wrote future histories, like Isaac Asimov in Foundation Trilogy and Robert Heinlein in The Past Through Tomorrow. Their editor, John Campbell, believed that science fiction empowers humanity in the creation of the future. And since then, there have been many other science fiction writers up to present times. I mentioned Van Vogt here because Van Vogt in Slan, which was one of the most popular, unquestionably popular science fiction books of the 1940s, wrote a vision of the future evolution of human consciousness, the slams. Cyberpunk more recently, with Gibson and Stevenson as a general mode of future consciousness where computers and the information age are brought into the science fiction visions of the future. And Robinson, more recently with the Ministry of the Future, where he attempts to combine together elements of future studies with elements of science fiction and presents warnings and prescriptions about the future, particularly concerning our economy and our environment. So science fiction is an immense area, and I just gave you a real quick intro to it. The other main development, future studies, involve the development of a set of methods for imagining possibilities, determining probabilities and plausibilities, evaluating preferable visions. My dear friend Wendell Bell wrote one of the most influential books in this area, Foundations of Future Studies, where future studies is seen as a way to improve human reality, and future studies emphasizes reason, evidence, and action. The Millennium Project, which is an ongoing systematic assessment of global trends, challenges, and opportunities, and efforts to improve them. There's a relatively core language and set of key concepts in future studies, like futures literacy, scenario building, foresight, anticipation studies. There's numerous organizations, the World Future Society, which is defunct now, the World Future Study Federation, my friend Victor Madi's Alternative Planetary Futures Institute. Future studies often involve critiques of Western civilization and Western future studies, like Richard Slaughter critiquing the materialism, objectivism, and technological futures that future studies have often produced. Limits to Growth as a key text, which predicted the collapse of contemporary modern world. But there's counter-reactions too, the transhumanist and pro-tech visions of the future, which highlight the value and importance of technology. There's been efforts to synthesize Eastern religion meditative approaches to the present and the future with future studies, including, for example, Aurobindo and Ken Wilber. Now, I mentioned at this last point here, and these efforts to synthesize, a very significant book I read quite a few years ago now was Richard Nisbet's The Geography of Thought, in which Nisbet presents a very evidence-based, convincing argument that there is a fundamental difference between how people think in the East and how people think in the West. We ended up with another dual theory of consciousness, one which is geographically and culturally articulated. The West being linear, progressive, analytic, more so, not exclusively, the East being more holistic, both and community instead of the West, which is more individualistic. So we may have some statistical differences between how people think in the East and how people think in the West regarding both reality and regarding how to conceptualize and think about the future. And these go back to a lot of different sources in history. So future studies at a global level, there's a great diversity of views on it. Now, I'm probably going to go over about 10 minutes. I apologize, but I want to go through these last few slides, because we're coming up to contemporary times. In the 60s and 70s, we see lots of social movements, which are critiques of the status quo of normal mindsets and power groups that seem to control the present and the future, where new visions of the future, new future consciousness images are proposed. We see postmodern critiques of science, objectivism, and Eurocentric mindset. A good book dealing with this is Walter Truett Anderson's book, Reality Wasn't What It Used to Be, where he contrasts absolutism versus relativism. I also have up here my book, Contemporary Futurist Thought, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about here is drawn out of that book, but I've added some other things too. In the last 50 years, pervasive computerization of human reality, the internet and personal computers. Computers control and manage most aspects of human reality. This is a significant transformation in human consciousness. The last 50 years, the ongoing growth of affluence. We have more material products, more presumed necessities of everyday life, okay? But there's still an apparent growing separation between the extremely wealthy and extremely poor. But we are seeing this accelerated growth of production and consumption. And this embodies or reflects this ongoing dominant philosophy of economic growth and progress as the ideal vision for the future of humanity, a fundamental theme of future consciousness, and an ideal way in which to organize and evaluate one's life. We're also seeing increasing management of the environment. The wilderness is disappearing. But we see counter-reactions to that, like we see counter-reactions to the materialistic economic vision of progress. Paul Ray and Anderson, what's her last name? I can't read her last name. Well, anyway, I read the book, but I can't remember Anderson's first name. I apologize. They make a distinction in their book on American culture between traditionalists, modernists, and cultural creatives. The traditionalists valuing things from the past, the modernists valuing the cutting wave of progress today, the capitalist, high-tech view, and cultural creatives who want to find some alternative way to think about the future. And the thing to bring up here is that this threefold distinction, which they developed back, I think, 20, 30 years ago, still captures some of the tension between different mindsets about the present and where to go in the future and what is of central value, whether it's a return to the past and the ethics of the past, whether it's to continue to embrace economic technological progress, or whether it's to strike out in a different direction. We have a fundamental tradition-based counterreaction, fundamentalism, which emerged over the last 100 years, which is toward modernism, which is reflective of the longstanding conflict in thinking about the future between order, stability, and what occurred in the past versus the new and the changing. And this is captured in Karen Armstrong's book, The Battle for God. But we have a pronounced contemporary uncertainty, and anybody honest is going to definitely acknowledge it, that we're not that convinced or certain about what tomorrow is going to bring. And we have certain identifiable existential risks like nuclear war, climate change, the techno singularity, overpopulation, the reduction of biodiversity, mass extinctions, continued inequality, increased consumerism. We're drowning in our garbage. We have a loss of standards and the value of truth, where we conflate truth and fantasy. We have lots of reasons to be uncertain, lots of things to realize. And it's compounded by, in fact, it's intensified by the fact that change seems to be accelerating. We had Future Shock by Alvin Toffler. More recently, we had Douglas Rushkoff's Present Shock. We can't even keep up with the present anymore. The exponential curve is the icon, like everything's accelerating. This is generating lots of conscious stress, anxiety, pessimism, and nihilism in human consciousness. So we want to evolve, we want to improve, but we're very nervous about whether we're going to get through tomorrow. So we have hope and fear continuing as both competing mindsets, effective components of future consciousness. Now, there's diverse contemporary paradigms of the future and future consciousness, which contain predictions, preferences, warnings. They cover all dimensions of the future. People think about all dimensions of the future. A theory is an abstract explanation of some dimension of reality. A paradigm is a theory plus all the ways of life and physical instrumentality and environmental supports and values that go along with the theory. So we say a person lives a paradigm, a person believes in a theory. A theory is a more narrow concept. We often have paradigms here, paradigms of consciousness, ways of thinking, living, valuing, and doing in the present. Now, one cluster of theories and paradigms focuses around change. There was Toffler's Future Shock, Barbara Marx Hubbard's Conscious Evolution, accelerative technological change with Ray Kurzweil. We have theories that focus on scientific and technological dimensions of human reality, often pro-science technology, like transhumanism, biotech views, AI robots, the global mind and the internet, outer space, and critiques of these mindsets. Like I mentioned Didsbury and Jennifer Gidley in her book, The Future, a very short introduction, and Nicholas Carr's The Shallows, which are excellent critiques. And finally, Neil Postman, both Amusing Ourselves to Death and Technopoly, which are critiques of the scientific technological mindset with respect to the future. We have ecological environmental theories and paradigms, like Gaia with James Lovelock, and I have up there The Revenge of Gaia, one of his more recent books. And we have the Back to Nature, the Green Movement, environmentalism, conservatism, sustainability, a whole cluster of different paradigms and theories about the future of the environment, where it is today, what do we need to change it, how we have to change our attitudes and our mindset, in essence, how to change and transform our consciousness from the way it has been in the past if we're going to maintain a livable and flourishing environment in which to live. Or as Lovelock thinks, maybe it's too late. Now, I want to bring in here, just because I'm talking about consciousness and the evolution of it, that in the last 50 years, there's been a lot going on in human psychology, psychological perspectives on the future, the study of consciousness. So our self-consciousness about our consciousness, about our psychology, and scientific, philosophical, spiritual efforts to understand and guide it all is continued to grow. With cognitive psychology, the mind was reintroduced into psychology, Noam Chomsky being one of the significant figures that critiqued behaviorism. So the mind came back in. We had the emergence of self-actualization psychology with Abraham Maslow, who's been a very influential thinker, and Carl Rogers, who debated Skinner on self-actualization versus behaviorist psychology, a very famous debate. We have O'Hare's notion of the transformational self. So we have different self-actualization theories of both the ideal form of consciousness. And in fact, Rogers, articulated an ideal form of future consciousness or future humanity in one of his publications. We have this incredible growth of pop psychology, of the me generation, of the culture of narcissism. We're very concerned with self-improvement, very concerned with mental health. But the fact is, mental health is actually in a state of escalating deterioration. We have a lot of drug abuse, a lot of depression, a lot of a loss of a sense of identity, a lot of anxiety disorders. We are not psychologically and consciously a very happy and functioning reality throughout parts of the world, especially in the West. We have this ongoing, continued evolution of drug culture and drug interventions. It's both in mass culture and it's both in psychiatry and psychotherapy. We had the development, the popularization at least, because it goes back a lot further than recently, of psychedelics as ways to enhance and evolve consciousness. But in general, even though we may focus on consciousness, we take lots of chemicals, lots of drugs, and all kinds of different ways to enhance and improve our consciousness. More recently, we had the development of positive psychology, which focuses on strengths in human consciousness, strengths in human psychology, and how to enhance them, like with Martin Seligman with flourishing and Csikszentmihalyi with the evolving self. There's also been efforts to synthesize Western positive psychology with Eastern positive psychology. And if anybody's interested, I'll send you a couple of references on that. But in terms of studying consciousness, a big growing area has been brain science and medical brain interventions. So even if one isn't a material, even if one rejects materialism, there's sure as hell been a lot of growth, a lot of increased understanding on how the brain and the nervous system is connected with consciousness and both functioning and dysfunctioning consciousness. But there's been the emergence of various groups of consciousness studies with diverse perspectives. There's been a growth in mindfulness, Eastern inroads into Western pop psychology. And the Eastern inroads have gone back further than just simply the more recent development in the West of mindfulness practices. There's Walter Truman Anderson again with postmodern pluralistic evolution of the self and the next enlightenment. I mentioned Slaughter and Wilbur already as futurists and philosophers, and Slaughter's argument that future studies is minimize the individual interior of or consciousness, and future studies should expand into that area. And I just re-mention again here Ryan Eisler and the notion of a partnership consciousness. So lots been going on in psychology, the study of consciousness and people's efforts over the last 50 years. Now, for other paradigms, we have paradigms and theories that focus on social global issues like the end of history and the last man, the world is flat, all connected now, all of those focusing on global issues. We have theories and paradigms that focus on spiritual religious ideas of East and West. I have up here Sri Aurobindo, Ken Wilber, Brief History of Everything. And I also have up here, and Sam Harris on contemporary atheism, the end of faith. And I have also up here a really mind-blowing integrative vision, The Physics of Immortality by Frank Tipler, which attempts to unite together cosmology, the resurrection of the dead, the evolution of the universe, and computers all in one big fat package. And we have integrative holistic theories, Tipler being one. Wells and Stapleton were very integrative and holistic, attempting to pull together all the dimensions of human reality, fundamental dimensions. The Millennium Project definitely does that. Ken Wilber tends to do that. Walter Truett Anderson attempts to do that. Don't select out one aspect of the future, look at the whole big picture. And my dear friend, Copthorne MacDonald, with his study of wisdom, such as in matters of consequence, attempted to integrate into a general theory all dimensions of reality, human reality, and how to evolve them with wisdom as the central goal that we should be aspiring toward in our evolution of consciousness. So as a general note, we live in a contentious, but also cooperative in lot kind of ways, multiplicity of ideologies and pragmatics about how to understand consciousness, how to understand the future, how to articulate our future consciousness, how we should purposefully evolve. We have ethnic, nationalist, corporate, and global groups delving into all these different questions, organizations, and they are striving toward articulating and working toward different preferable visions of the future, sometimes in line with each other, sometimes not. But a key takeaway point, human consciousness is fundamentally, and always has been, a pluralistic reality. We do not get universal buy-in ever on anything. We always have conflicts, oppositions. There's always another point of view. No civilization has ever dominated the scene with one mindset. Even any civilization, like in the US, for example, we have multiple mindsets that are at odds with each other, all of which are trying to win over the others and trying to evolve themselves on their own and have an impact on the future direction of our consciousness, our values, our ethics, our society, and our way of life. So, I went through the historical evolution of consciousness and future consciousness and the evolution of life and the main capacities of consciousness, the prehistoric origins and evolution of humanity, the Great Awakening, the emergence of civilizations, the three-stage theory, and the importance of future consciousness and purposeful consciousness driving the evolution of civilizations, both of our conscious, social, ethical dimensions and our material, technological dimensions. I looked at some different theories of consciousness and how to purposely evolve consciousness, and there's stages to it. Then I looked at in depth the evolution of future consciousness and consciousness through ancient, modern, 20th century, contemporary times. Highlighted out science fiction as the evolutionary mythology of the future and future studies. They're distinct, but they're connected together in various ways, thinking about possible and predictive and preferable futures. Looked at some tensions and trends, like stability versus change. We keep having this argument for centuries and centuries. Hope and fear and anxiety against each other. and uncertainty. Other people being certain. We have reason and science on one hand versus emotions and the artistic on the other hand, or reason versus faith. We have materialism versus consciousness perspectives. We have ongoing existential risks that add uncertainty into the whole picture. And our contemporary array of paradigms in the future, which include integrative theories, are in an evolutionary and interactive pluralism with each other. So, thank you for staying with me an extra 15 minutes. In 3 weeks, we will do the principle of reciprocity on May 24th. And again, thank you, Terry, for your great graphics. And that's it. And I will get rid of